everybody.
Hi.
Okay. Very well. So, welcome to today's lecture. I am pleased to be in front of you. I will be joined today by an esteemed guest, Deacon Tracey Cole from the Canaan Baptist Church. My name is Victor Zagabe. I'm also teaching here as part of your PMCI faculty. And I will be going through a presentation that will be going to elaborate on my particular research and practice interests, a few of the projects that I've done individually and within collectives, within practices in industry. And then I'm also going to be talking about a bit of the background that I have relative to 116th Street, and then also how this expands beyond the purview of what we're going to be taking on this particular term. So one of the things that's notable to know about me is that the previous studio that I did was also PMCI based, and it was also tethered to this particular community partner that we have. And so there's an ongoing history and lineage which we're going to be continuing with, and this is one thing that I want everyone to sort of be aware of. So mind you, I'll be going through things relatively quickly. I want you to understand where I'm coming from in terms of my own positionality. And I think it's going to be a productive engagement and utilization of your time. So with that being said, we are a part of the Generative Histories Harlem Part 3. We are part of Generative Histories in particular. Today you'll be speaking with me and Deacon Tracey. You'll also be speaking with Alia, who is one of the students from the past term who was working and researching in Harlem for our particular community partner, Canaan Baptist Church. And one of the things that I want you to know about me in particular is that I am a Congolese Canadian. I come from Eastern DRC, came through the Francophone world, through Egypt, through Quebec, to Canada, interested in the architectural practice, but really interested in how it was related to cultural histories and things of that nature. And so when I thought about the kinds of works that I took on, I went to the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, which is known for both cultural history and technological insights and things of that nature. And I've always been interested in tethering things that seem rather disparate and seeing what kind of connections I might be able to make. And so when you're looking at the kind of research that I bring upon, that's something that you're going to sort of notice. And so in regards to cultural history, I began my research in graduate school by looking at the relationships between post-colonial nation building. And so there was this particular museum called the Royal Museum of Central Africa, based in Tervuren, Belgium. I did my thesis under the supervision of Robert Jan van Pelt, and the idea was to really begin to think about how restitution debates began to be spatialized in various ways. This is a particular painting by Sherry Simba, which is called the Reorganization Painting, really beginning to talk about the struggles of what it means to have looted artifacts be returned and to be owned by the diaspora or people within the continent itself. And so the DRC and its diaspora has been talking about the return of looted cultural patrimony, but the debate has always been about who is seen as legitimate in terms of an arbitrator and as someone who can actually take care of these artifacts. And there are oftentimes laws delegated to international law that oftentimes begin to identify who is seen as a legitimate stakeholder, which means that now grassroots efforts, typically in restitution debates, are ignored, and what is typically seen as legitimized are state sanctioned actions. And so one of the primary means through which this typically occurs is through the officiation of parliamentary committees or through a president asking for something back, whereas if a local chief were to say, hey, this is actually my the work of my people, I would like to have it returned, this would be seen as less legitimate. And so a part of what I've been interested in terms of my research trajectory is how to begin to legitimize how some of these grassroots efforts are oftentimes being thought about in national debates and how this may be thought of in different ways. And so one of the reasons why this particular museum was important was because it was created as a sort of concretization or legitimization of the sort of colonial empire in particular. So I've always thought about how to pair sites that are oftentimes seen as disparate and disconnected and how to design in two places at once. And so this is just kind of a painting that basically describes that. In the summer of 2020, the racial re-reckoning of George Floyd murder kind of reignited this flame yet again. And so what happened within the United States re-perpetuated itself, and so Black internationalism was always a part of the larger discussion that I've always had. And it created, again, a Belgian Federal Parliament Committee examining the colonial past. And the hope for that was to try to reconcile some of the issues that had been had within the country of Belgium itself and try to situate it within a larger discussion around Blackness in 2020. Again, there were many criticisms of it, but that is essentially where I kind of began. And so the notion of nourishing things that are typically intangible or not seen in physical space manifests itself in various ways. This is another project that I did as a group, where we essentially began to identify how we might be able to reposition ourselves in relation to light pollution and what is missing in the night sky as a result of our urban domestication. And so this is a project with Formlab that was conducted in order to recreate this, and the idea was to think about this as a starscape that people would walk underneath and sort of occupy. And this is one of the projects that I've done in order to nourish intangible networks. This is another project that I participated upon that was more so dealing with phenomenology of the sound around you, that was trying to adapt how you actually modulate the through space based off of how your audio sort of repercussions in spatial movements might create different zones of intensity and those of less intensity. And of course, there's the work that I did at Rogers Partners, where they work on the Boys and Girls Club here in New York City. And then of course, there's some advocacy work that I've done. So the advocacy work that I've done is primarily through a couple of organizations. I mean, more than three, but I'll show two today. First is Design's Protest, the second is Dark Matter U, the third is Architects Against Housing Alienation. With Design's Protest, it's primarily a group that was introduced to me in 2020, and I joined in 2021. I became an organizer by thinking about the ways in which I wanted to buttress some of the research that I was taking on regarding museum restitution issues in particular, and the issues of cultural patrimony, because I realized that actually doing advocacy on your own was actually rather difficult if you were untethered to an institution or organizing groups. Those are typically the things that are seen as legitimate and are thus listened to wholeheartedly. And so what I wanted to identify are ways in which I could uplift this kind of work in as many ways as I could. So I joined as many teams as I could, and I did as much as I possibly could with the time that I had in what was, again, quite a culture shock and a reckoning also of the lack of healthcare systems that we all realized that we had. And so one thing to note is that I come from a family that is not typically architecture based. I come from a healthcare family. Everybody is a doctor in some way, shape, or form, or a nurse in some way, shape, or form, or a pharmacist, because in Eastern Congo, with all the conflicts occurring, that is typically one of the more noble professions one could take, in which you could make money but also support your community. And so I figured, architecture is kind of close set, and it could actually help me rethink the ways in which we relate to sort of cultural patrimony if you thought about it from the standpoint of advocacy from the margins. So when I talk about marginal theories and things of that nature, I'm really talking about the notion of prophecy. When we think about, marginal populations, we often think about those who typically have to bear the brunt of much of the issues of climate change or perhaps social inequalities. And if you can design for those populations, typically you'll be able to design for most others, which is why you sort of see my trajectory take the way that it take the route that it has. And so I worked with a few calls, one which was to sort of create a call to action to distance architectural organizations from gun lobbying groups, which is important, which I think as a Canadian, I don't understand why this is still an issue in the United States. And then of course there's planning and policy, and then healing hostile architecture. Those are all sort of groups that I joined later on. This was a project that was taken on by a team, I think primarily led by Fozia Kahani and Alexia Gonzalez here in New York City, Dina Darby as well. I was here to support in order to make sure that some of the elements of the built environment were essentially being taken seriously as things that were harmful for those who essentially use them in order to either rest, loiter in productive ways, or engage in ways that weren't essentially hyper-tethered to capitalist production or reenactment. And so hostile architecture is typically design which is meant to perturb or distance oneself from the distance those who are not typically hostile architecture is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's meant to be as uncomfortable as it can be in order to deter non-human life, human life. Typically, it's meant to deter people who are lower income, if you really want to think about it pragmatically, and those who aren't as seen as valuable within the sort of classist monetary system that we have here in the United States, our own version of caste, essentially. And then within Dark Matter U, you've worked within various different projects, both with a few faculty members here, including Jerome Hayford, and we wanted to sort of investigate different ways in which the academic endeavor could be subverted and thought of differently. And so now the first project that I go through is going to be the Freedom Ride, which is tangentially tethered to our guest here in terms of her own relations, and it's a travel essentially experience and educational program that has been designated as in reference to the historical freedom rides done in the American South. And so the idea for this particular project was to begin to think about how we can consider our relationship to the South differently and think about travel as transgression, rather than to think simply as the Grand Tours would situate it within the realm of elite re-enlightenment. And then, of course, there's the exhibition that I did at the Lisbon Triennale, which began to think about the reclassification of knowledge forms in subversive ways. And then the Dark Matter issue, which was a groundbreaking project, which was done to honor the erasures of both Justin Garrett Moore and Stephen Gray in trying to pluralize the ways in which voices might be seen in publishing, and also to change the ways in which that might also be seen. And so the idea was to really begin, and here's me with my backpack, which is iconic in so many ways, and has lasted so long. And then there's an augmented reality application which we worked with in order to try to understand the different ways in which one might be able to tether different lines of research. And so when you begin to think about the notions of nourishing intangible connections or intangible networks and things of that nature, you begin to see how these might be threaded together in both the more cultural institutions that I work with and how that may be tethered in historical wrongdoings, or how it may be tethered to something that might be digitized and relegated to something like an application that we're all working towards. So again, travel as transgression is something that I've been interested in, whether it be for the sake of education or whether it be for the sake of talking about mobility. Mobility as a right, beginning to think about the fictitious nature of borders and how we relate to them, both as a historical fragment, as somebody who understands the positionality as a Congolese Canadian on American soil, dealing with African American histories that are both enlightening to me as a method of emancipation, but also interesting as we begin to situate ourselves within Harlem in particular. And one of the things that we did, of course, was to begin to think about what the nature of architectural travel might be in and of itself. So typically architectural travel is situated within this classical tradition of the Grand Tour, which is made for European aristocrats coming in from England or other sort of spaces to travel alongside many different prominent sites that you may already know, the Pantheon, the Parthenon, typically Greece and Italy, modern day. And the idea was to give them a few different options, which was one, to acquaint them with the sort of notions of classical antiquity and the structures that were important to that, but also to give them a bit of freedom in their sort of time of, in their coming of age, quite frankly. And so we have that as one sort of particular framework that many different schools still typically use. And we have a different way of also re-examining, and this is typically part of the Western canon. Like the structures that people would have seen within the Grand Tours are a part of many of the canons that we look at. And then the Freedom Ride as a sort of investigation of how we might travel differently within the architectural education was really beginning to think about where the spaces of resistance might be, where those lines of transgression might take us, and how we might build both new liberatory practices, but perhaps even structures in relation to that in the way that I've sort of conceived, understood, and digested this sort of idea identity. And so many different people from various universities sort of came together, not necessarily as university affiliations, but from various different universities, in order to coalesce and begin to think about how we might think about the South relatively differently, because if we think about it relative to the global sphere, the global South is relegated to a certain kind of perception, but also the American South has a different perception that we are given to it. And so there's this notion of subversion that is typically relegated to the appropriation of how we look at geography and orientation. And so what we have now is like, okay, the Summer Institute is based off of a multi-year program which was funded that will result in a few different deliverables, a publication, an exhibition, and a few other items. We went to Tuskegee, legacy sites, and this was in the American South, so Alabama, Georgia, things of that nature, and many different people came together in order to sort of begin to reconceive their relationships in liberatory movements across the American South, both to Black populations, but also to the indigenous groups that have been on the land. And so one of the most stunning and most beautiful and profound days that we had was the day in which we went onto Egan Evalija, which is a group of Muskogee people, which created an eco-village. And the idea was to really begin to think about how, for me, as somebody who's positioning themselves not from the American South, beginning to think about how indigeneity was relegated in comparison to the African American sort of narrative, because what was beautiful was their sort of telling of both their practices, which were trying to sort of reclaim their own cultures, and as their byproducts, sort of rematriating the land in many different ways, but also being able to sort of note and relate to the various African Americans which had long ongoing legacies of discrimination as well in this space. And so we both went to this particular site, which was really interesting and healing. They had amazing and fantastic food, which they downplayed. And we also went over to the legacy sites that same day, where they also began to speak about, in some ways, about the indigenous groups on the land itself. And so it was an interesting cross-pollination of groups speaking about themselves, but also of each other, that I think is really important to have in various educational paradigms. The previous studio that I did here was called Material Diasporas, Harlem in Translation, looked at tangibility and poetics as a means of thinking about how we can work more ethically. Alia was a part of that course here, so thank you very much for joining us. It was a really interesting term where we began to think about material culture and forensic analysis as a way to think about material narratives and how they relate to labor, value, and extraction, to reimagine the conventions of material legends, maps, and details in such ways that they would no longer be seen as neutral, because as we know, nothing is neutral in this world. Everything is oriented to a particular power structure, and we need to identify the ways in which we might be positioned relative to it. So the Place, Memory, and Culture Incubator is mapped in many different places across Harlem, and we are on 116th Street, and my particular studio itself in that particular term began at the right here at the Shabazz Market and expanded westwards. I don't like to say that, actually expanded westwards. It leapt to the west. It sounds, you see what I'm trying to avoid. It's not manifest destiny. It just, we walked in that direction. And so we are doing something slightly similar this term, but at a different point. And we really thought about the notion of material extraction and also where they came from as a means of working with the materials, and also beginning to think about their stories. And so there's this book called Africans in Harlem by Bukari Sawadogo, which we used in order to sort of entrench ourselves into the histories of the intermingling between African Americans and then also of recently arrived African immigrants in Harlem. And that was one of the main distinctions that we wanted to make, which is to say that that story is really interesting and layered, and it's sometimes extremely beautiful, but sometimes there are rifts. And so we wanted to identify where those were, and also began to relate to the different ways in which those created various cultural institutions, with the African Americans primarily being Christian, and some of the most recently arrived African immigrants also being Muslim. But of course, there's intermixes of many different faiths and practices and customs that all begin to be coalesce together. And so that studio was looking at materiality, tangibility, poetics, ethics, expanding cultural preservation, and beginning to think about design for placekeeping. We thought about timelines very rigorously, and we'll provide you with this as a method of research as well. And then began to think about annotating the city, the as-built, and what that might actually mean. And so now we're going into the segment where we're talking about the Canaan Baptist Church of Christ. And so the question that this particular group, thank you, Alia, for joining us today, for also chiming in for a slide or two. They were looking at how shifts in material choices in aesthetic perception and preservation practice reshape architecture's relationship to memory and cultural value. And so they looked at how in Harlem, whose histories are honored and whose are concealed through renovation and repair. And so they did this really beautiful research where they really engaged with the community quite a bit. I know that I would love to also give you the floor, and so what I'll do, because we're talking about Canaan Baptist Church, I will give Alia a couple of minutes just to speak about this particular research. There's just a few slides here, right? So realistically, if you don't mind just speaking about what your endeavor was, and then, of course, Deacon Tracey Cole can also speak about what she has been doing too. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Wow, there's a lot of you. I'm just going to start by passing these around. One of them is I think you guys have seen this. I'm just going to pass it to some of yours. One is these are newspapers that my partner and I from last semester created. One of them is about 116th Street and the individual sites that we investigated and how they all kind of come together to build 116th Street. And then the other one is one focused solely on the history of the Canaan Baptist Church. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we started last semester. We started by choosing two materials. My partner chose the material stucco that is the sign is made of, and then I chose to study glass blocks, both of which they happen to be in the same building, so we were fortunate to get that. And then we started to look at how those two materials are represented architecturally, and we played with textures to graphically strengthen the representation of those materials. We did an investigation of the site, mostly just the entryway, because we wanted our project to be more like a highlighted space where everyone can view something to really catch people's eye once they walk into the building. We conducted research about this is for my final, my bad, sorry. So this is a summary of basically one of those newspapers I'm gathering around. So it was a history about Dr. Y.T. Walker, about the founding of the church, and just the overall timeline from its founding till now. And then another part of the project was to study some people who were significant to the development and the upkeep of the church. And then we also looked at some of the additional sites in Harlem that the church has connection to and its influences on the community. Back to material studies, we looked at the glass blocks and the stucco at a very intimate scale. So we studied them from human and non-human perspectives. We looked at how the individual materials, they were founded and how those materials came into Harlem. So looking at them from an international scale and how they moved into the local scale of Harlem to the church. I'm not going to go into it because I don't remember much of it. And then we looked at, what were these? Oh, the making of each material. So where they are founded, how they are made, and how they are assembled. And this was the final project. I don't know if you could see. So we chose to, going back to our line of inquiry, which is how these materials, we investigated how these materials can be used to create a structure, create some kind of addition that could be used to preserve the history and the people of the church. So we used plaster as a representation for stucco, and we used glass blocks to see, and we created like this wall addition. Can you zoom in from here or no? So this would be an integration into this space over here. This space over here. Minus the model is more diagrammatic because structurally we just couldn't build it. So we used plaster to create the portraits of the three reverends that were the three reverends of the church, and then we used glass blocks over here to these were more experimental. They could represent moments in time of the reverends or the people or historical moments of the church that people feel are significant. But for this project we used them to show the women and their significant influences on the church. And then over here we included a timeline of what was basically this up there. To kind of just to put the entire model together, how we envision this in the future, or if we continue to develop it, would be more like every block is used to represent a moment in time. So a drawing or like an image from a newspaper, and it would just show every significant moment, or even a small moment that helped the church become what it is now. And I think that was it, right?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. And then. Sorry? Leave this up? Okay. Did you want to come up?
No. I'm gonna go because I have to finish.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm Deacon Tracey. I'm a deacon at Canaan Baptist Church. I grew up in Harlem, so I'm a native Harlemite. I have been a member of Canaan Baptist Church for over 30 years. My first pastor was Pastor Wyatt T. Walker. Prior to what I also do, I have over 25 plus years at Goldman Sachs. And when my position relocated to Salt Lake City, I didn't want to relocate to Salt Lake City. So I'm presently at Jefferies, which is similar to Goldman Sachs, and I handle restricted stock transfers. So that's what I do when I'm not a deacon at Canaan, and also the business administrator there. I joined Canaan under the leadership of Wyatt T. Walker. Canaan was, prior to the pictures that you saw from Aaliyah's project, it was a former Loews Theater right there on 116th Street. Canaan moved to that location in 1965. This year, 2026, we'll be celebrating our 94th church anniversary. Under the auspices of Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker was a civil rights icon. He was the right-hand man to Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King actually installed Dr. Walker as the pastor at Canaan Baptist Church a week before he was assassinated in 1968. We have been the host to Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and with Dr. Walker's work with Dr. Martin Luther King, we also have, we just lost him recently, Reverend Dr. Jesse Jackson. Dr. Walker was also, this photo was taken on 116th Street when back in the early 70s, it was overran with drugs. And this photo was of Dr. Walker. He did receive death threats behind it about trying to clean up 116th Street. This is actually on 116th Street, a couple of doors away from the church at that time. Dr. Walker was also instrumental with those of you who are familiar with National Action Network. He was their first president. He actually gave Reverend Al Sharpton the first $10,000 to start up National Action Network. So Dr. Walker is known worldwide for his civil rights. He also, if you're familiar with 125th Street State Office Building, he worked with Nelson Rockefeller to get the funding for that building as well. Canaan right now, if you can move, Canaan right now is for our work in the community. We continue that. The church itself holds annual coat drives. We've worked with the Department of Sanitation, Department of Transportation, to reach out to, with the neighborhood changing and the block itself. We have a lot of businesses in the block that a lot of the people are from Senegal. And so to embrace them in the community, because we also have businesses in the block that are owned by Senegalese people, we gave out helmets, vests, and everything to help those who ride their bicycles and everything. We also help them get the people involved to actually replace some of the e-bikes that they're, because of what some of the e-bikes, the fires and everything that they have caused, try to help them replace the e-bikes. So we're trying to engage the changing community from what it was here to what it is now, from 116th Street, from Lenox Avenue, going all the way across as far as housing. Canaan itself has a Canaan Housing Board, which we have over maybe 15 buildings in the vicinity that have lower income housing. We actually own the building next door to the church that we're trying to work on the funding right now to renovate it. What else would you like me to focus on?
So one of the things that we're doing in these faculty stakeholder talks is to think about the ways in which we might actually be discussing. Thank you for the introduction. I'm curious if you might be able to speak on how perhaps this particular church has been able to support other structures or groups on 116th Street. Is that something that you'd be able to elaborate on?
The church itself, we actually own we have a senior building right next door to the church, and that is named after, one of the previous slides, one of our Pastor Emeritus, E.M. Moore. So that is one of our senior buildings. We also have a senior building named after Dr. Wyatt T. Walker on 118th Street. So as far as embracing in the community, we do that through our seniors. We have youth programs within the church itself. We have a Saturday church school. We have Sunday morning Bible study. And we're not only open to African Americans. The church is open where on Sundays we have various tour groups come in from all over the world. And some of those people, some of them were familiar with Dr. Walker and the work that he did, but it has made Canaan a beacon in the community, and it has helped us be open and an attraction for the last 94 years.
And what is one thing that Canaan would love to see preserved a little bit more on 116th Street?
I think right now, truthfully, probably the cost of housing. Is trying to maintain affordability on 116th Street as well as in Harlem itself. And like I said, we currently have buildings on, not any on 116th Street, but on 118th Street, some on 124th Street. So one of the priorities right now, and also, aside from housing, our next thing is trying to engage the next generation. Truthfully, during COVID, right after COVID, we lost a lot of people to bedside service. So it's like, what can we do to bring the next generation into the church? And one of the things we also like to focus on, a lot of people think you have to dress a certain way to come to church. Pretty much the doors of the church are open, and it should be come as you are. And we have a chapel. Our chapel is there. Right now we're open 6 days a week, So we do embrace people that may come by that may need, whether it's clothing. We have clothing drives monthly. And now we're also working on having a pantry that is available to the community as well.
Beautiful. Thank
Okay.
you. So, thank you very much. We have about 10 or so minutes left before a hard stop at 3 p.m., at which point I think it would be nice for Professor Hayford to introduce the next assignment.
Sure.
Or if you want to...
If anyone has any questions.
Yes, if you have questions for Deacon Tracey or for myself about Canaan Baptist Church, or perhaps the work that my particular studio is doing, please let us know now. And then, yeah.
Thank you for the enlightening and lovely presentation. It's wonderful to meet you, Deacon.
Yep.
I'm wondering how you're thinking of bringing in some of that research you did in the prior studio, if at all, on like materiality.
Mm-hmm.
How you're thinking of bringing it into this studio.
That's a great question. So one of the things that I've been interested in is trying to make sure that there's a cohesive arch with the PMCI research. We're working towards a publication that we have support using the grant money from. The materials are going to be worked in based off of a palette that we are utilizing. We're going to try to think about formalistic principles that also enamor and honor the material qualities that have been investigated in the past term. And so students will actually be given something to work with rather than a blank slate. And then they'll be asked to intervene in various facets that enhance this notion of lightness, which I'm really interested in my particular trajectory. Lightness is a method of thinking about the approach to people, but also to land. And so they've already begun to understand what the existing conditions of the intervention on the land is with the material research of the past term. And so now they're going to try to identify ways of sort of like maximizing how light they can be, but also how beautiful those structures can be relative to the material formations. And so what we're going to do, hopefully, is to investigate how the previous research can be amalgamated into something that's somewhat of a love letter to 116th Street in a publication itself that is a pluriversal story. And so what they've been working towards is a graphic novel that actually begins to tell at multiple scales the stories of various different issues across 116th Street. One of them, for example, could be one of access, an access-based issue. One of them is a service-based issue. When you tether that to a material connotation, that begins to reperpetuate itself at the urban scale. Then you can begin to think, okay, well, what's the relationship between concrete and access issues, or a particular different kind of material, and what certain kinds of populations need in order to enhance their experience on that street and to preserve a particular cultural ritual. So we're trying to think about how tangibility and poetics is still embedded within this work itself, but we're working with an existing framework that we'll be taking from the previous term and pushing into this term itself, and with a tangible output which is going to be synthesized into one larger publication that the students have already been working towards in some of their pre-existing drawings. And we're also going to be utilizing the work from the past term in this in order to buttress this so that it can be quite robust. So there's a lot of pre-existing research already on Canaan, thanks to Alia and also her partner Dennis. And then we also have a few other organizational groups that are going to be buttressed by some of the research that Jolly Sayers is going to be doing as a research associate for the PMCI. And so it's going to be partly historical research and partly projections of what it might be to address a multitude of issues. So somewhat similar to what was done on the sort of Lisbon Triennale exhibition, where I had different sort of thematic sequences that were sort of being addressed. This graphic book will also be able to address different issues across 116th Street as it relates to preservation and how that's being expanded upon. And so the work is going to materially synthesize itself into a proposal that will shift the perceptions of both materiality, tangibility, poetics, and ethics, the expansion of culture preservation, and design as placekeeping, but it will be done through a publication format which will be then given out to the community themselves, especially our partners here at Canaan Baptist Church, and of course a few others on the street. So that's how we're going to try to keep this particular line of research interwoven into what we're doing. And I think that it may be a beautiful way to sort of tether all these things together so that we're not simply thinking about as built, but rather thinking about how they can become sites of tangible sort of alchemy. Yes.
Yeah, thank you both. This was great. Thank you for coming. Sort of picking up off of that and Leah and Dennis's project, could you go back maybe 1, 2 slides, 3 slides? Yes, I was curious if you want to speak more about some thoughts that you've been having around memorializing more of this history inside your building, or how some ideas that maybe you've talked about with Aaliyah or others, or thought about.
Actually, I actually spoke with her again today on actually displaying her project. We get a lot of tours come in. Like I said, we get a lot of visitors. There's several groups within, there's one gentleman right on 116th and Lenox Avenue that brings tour groups in. But her timeline was so specific. It's something that we are looking to actually display at the church as part of, and I guess you could say an attraction for the tour groups. She gave us, where the desk is right now, possibly one of her renderings is not here, change that area that I'm looking at incorporating, and really appreciate, you know, someone coming in with a fresh eye and a different look. The glass itself, this is inside the church, but we also have the glass outside the church. The glass, this right here, some people felt like it was a security issue because the people in the office sometimes can't see out. But now the idea is maybe if we can leave it there, add in the photos that she did in her project, and incorporate all that together, maybe add some LED lights, and possibly move our security desk on the other side of the wall. So that's what we're looking at just from the project that she did. And like I said, having a different aspect, or, you know, seeing the lobby through someone else's eyes.
Nice. So you never know, your work has impact in the community.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you both so much.